We use social institutions like education, like laws or norms of reciprocity to promote people's well-being. We even use biological interventions already. Adding iodine to salt adds 10 to 15 IQ points to the next generation. Good diet promotes cognitive development. And Ritalin is used to improve attention and concentration and reduce impulsive violence. There's no difference between environmental interventions and biological interventions, and there's no difference between drugs in principle and genetic interventions apart from their risks. We already use our knowledge of how to protect the capacities necessary for well-being to remove threats to them. So, for example, lead was removed from paint and petrol because it reduces IQ, because IQ is valuable. We already use our genetic knowledge to select the next generation through what's called liberal eugenics, when we enable people to avoid genetic disorders like cystic fibrosis, thalassemia or Down syndrome. Parents should be allowed to access this technology to have children with better prospects of better lives, provided they don't harm their children or other people. Now, some people worry that this is going to reduce genetic diversity. But not all diversity is good. Psychopaths are a part of diversity. We should use gene editing to try to eliminate psychopaths. And while we did need genetic diversity to survive epidemics like HIV or corona in the past, now we have science to generate preventative strategies like the use of condoms or vaccination, or treatments like antiretroviral drugs. We now no longer are requiring the sort of genetic diversity that humanity required for most of its history. The opportunities are enormous. We may have IQs vastly greater than humans currently have today. We may no longer be the same species. Genes could be transferred from non-human animals to humans to provide them with bat sonar, hawk-like vision, enhanced memory, or even radical life extension. And the Methuselah mouse is a genetically engineered mouse that lives twice as long. We could do the same thing in humans. Should we? We need ethical principles like the promotion of well-being to guide us. Science can tell us how we can achieve things, but ethics can tell us whether we should. And the promotion of well-being is the central ethical principle. Thank you.
Our second speaker, Jamie Metzl, is a healthcare futurist, member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and author of Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity.
Hello, superhumans. If you are watching this broadcast and you are immunized or you are wearing glasses, you are already a superhuman. We are here at this incredible inflection point for our species. When you think about it, 100 years ago, there were only 2 billion humans on Earth, and only 20% of them were literate. That's 400 million people. Today, we have 7.5 billion people, 85% literacy. That means 6.5 billion people are able to contribute to the growth of our knowledge. That's why we're seeing this super convergence of all of our technologies. And that's pushing every technology and every science forward, including genetics and biotech. Whereas now, it's possible to read, write, and ultimately hack the code of all of life. And that's really exciting for all the reasons that Julian just mentioned. And it's also really scary because these, like any technologies, could be abused. We are going to see these technologies applied through our healthcare, where we're going to transition from our world of generalized healthcare based on population averages to precision healthcare based on each person's individual biology, to predictive healthcare once we have big data pools of genetic and life information that allows us to take preventive action to reduce harms. But the killer application of these technologies is going to be in not just changing the way we make babies, but changing the nature of the babies we make. We're going to move from conception through sex to conception through in vitro fertilization, and then embryo screening, and then limited genome editing of pre-implanted embryos. And we're going to do it both to reduce risks and to confer benefits, and there will be no natural line between those two. There are lots of great reasons, like Julian just mentioned, why we can and I think ultimately should do this. Nature by definition and genetics by definition are buggy. That means that many of our children are born with these terrible, in some cases deadly, genetic mutations. And if we can fix or prevent them, why shouldn't we? We're now experiencing a global coronavirus epidemic. If we could, at some point in the future, safely engineer future humans to be immune to all types of deadly pathogens and viruses, that would conceptually save our species. We know our planet is warming. We know that our sun is going to die and this planet will be uninhabitable. If you believe, as I do, that humans should go on, we need to find a way to make that possible. But there are very real and significant risks that come with this technology. They could be abused. We could use it to limit the diversity, the essential diversity, which is the sole survival strategy of our species. They could be distributed in an unequal way that could divide us in really dangerous and terrible ways. And so when we look at these technologies, it's certainly the wrong answer to say they can never be used. If we have these tools that could save our future generations from terrible suffering and death, whether it's our children or preventing our parents from getting dementia or Alzheimer's, we should do that. If the same way, if there are terrible abuses, we can prevent them. And the way we're going to find this balance is not by having an either-or environment, but we need to find a middle ground where we use a risk-benefit analysis to find the best way forward, because we have to find a way to make sure our most sacred values can guide the application of our most powerful technologies. And that should be all of our business. Thank you.
Our third speaker, Katie Hassan, is the Program Director on Genetic Justice at the Center for Genetics and Society in Berkeley, California. Katie writes, speaks, researches, and teaches about the social and political aspects of human genetic and reproductive technologies.
Let's really imagine this world where each baby's DNA is manipulated from the moment of their conception in the lab, where parents' immediate desires are written into their future children's genome and the generations to come. What would this world look like? Would the, quote, best genomes go to the most privileged? Would we find our society divided into genetic haves and have-nots? These are crucial questions that we need to consider as we make this decision whether to go forward with heritable germline editing, altering the DNA of eggs, sperm, embryos to affect the traits of the children that will come from them. I'm here to make the case that this practice is not safe, it's not needed, and it has the potential to vastly increase the already outrageous inequality that we're experiencing. Many believe that germline editing is necessary to prevent the transmission of serious genetic diseases, but it's not the case. Parents who know that they're at risk of passing on a condition and would like to have an unaffected child and also be related, to have the child be related to both parents genetically, are already able to do this with an established and safe embryo screening technique. Now, embryo screening and selection raises a number of serious ethical concerns. But germline editing amplifies these concerns and carries additional safety and societal risks. What germline editing makes possible that selection does not is this prospect of human enhancement. And this is where we could see its most dangerous effects in exacerbating inequalities. Even if enhancing complex traits like IQ or musical talent is technically dubious, as it is at the moment, supposedly enhanced children would be perceived and treated differently. And since it would likely be that these technologies were available only to the wealthy, at least at first, the advantages that these children had would be attributed to their genetics rather than to privilege. We might end up writing our current cultural biases into the genomes of generations to come. Would-be parents could feel pressured to choose traits from a very narrow range of cultural and social norms. And because these biases actually influence the way that we define disease, it really is such a fuzzy line to try to say which of these uses would be medical and which wouldn't. We might also find that disability would be even further stigmatized than it is today. Heritable genome editing is not inevitable. Dozens of countries have already prohibited it. This is a place where we have the opportunity to draw a clear line. We can develop this technology to treat sick patients and not to design babies. We should imagine the future that we want to build for the generations to come. I think we'll see that heritable genome editing will not get us there. Thank you.
So these were the three different positions, Katie, Jamie, and Julian. Let me quickly recap to give you a sense of what the essence of each argument was. We started by hearing Julian Savulescu telling us why he is all for human genetic enhancement, saying the opportunities are simply enormous and there is, in fact, a moral imperative to enhance well-being through science and gene editing, and that parents should be free to select or enhance their children's capabilities as long as it doesn't cause harm to anyone else. He also predicts that one day humans might evolve into another species. Jamie Metzel already believes we're superhumans. He said there are a great many reasons why we should embrace this, but we should also be aware of the potential pitfalls. It doesn't make sense, he believes, to ban technologies that could have huge benefits. Neither does it make sense to allow a genetic free-for-all, where there is so much at stake for everyone. So the only reasonable way to look at this is through some kind of regulation. But there is an urgency to act, and act now on this. Katie Hassan, we just heard her lay the case for why she is completely against genetic enhancement. She argues that the practice of editing genes is not safe, nor is it needed. It will only increase existing inequalities and perhaps even create new ones. It raises serious ethical questions and concerns, and she believes that its development and application are not inevitable, that we must think this through, and it is up to us, up to society, to decide what to do with this. So you heard the arguments. We now want to hear from you. What do you think?
It's time to vote. We need your input to find common ground among the speakers. We want to know exactly how much value you attach to the arguments you've heard. You have a total of 100 points to divide. You can divide them over 1, 2, or all 3 statements. To do so, simply assign points to the statements on a sliding scale.
So please go to dohadebates.com/vote and tell us what you think. And as you're voting, you might also consider many different questions and layers to this argument and this debate. Do the opportunities and benefits that can arise from genetic engineering outweigh the possible risks that you heard laid out? Is the prospect of creating superhumans way too scary and best left to action movies, perhaps? Do we need strict rules and regulations, even if that means at the end of the day that we do limit what is eventually possible? And how would you feel? How would you feel about this if we were talking about your child's body and your child's DNA? So while you're considering all of your options and while the votes are being counted, let's go once again to Nelufar and see what reactions we're getting online. Nelufar.
Thank you, Rida. Yes, well, our speakers have made their case and they are trying to get your votes to see who you agree with most. What solution speaks to you? And you guys are speaking to me via your comments on Twitter and Facebook. So thank you to those of you watching online sending in your comments. Remember, you can also go onto Instagram and send me a video of your thoughts, feelings and opinions. Just log on to the Instagram app. Make sure that you click on that little paper arrow. That is the direct message function. Once you're in there, search for us. We are Doha Debates. Click on us. Once you've done that, hold your phone up, press the blue button with the camera and record away. How do you think the debate is going so far? What are your thoughts and opinions? Get in touch with me, send those videos in. You've already had your say on Twitter, and I'm just going to go through some of the comments that have caught my eye. Ayadatullah in Tucson, Arizona, USA says, there is exactly a 0% chance that non-disease-oriented gene manipulation will be used ethically. Also, it will turn people without the financial means to access it into an underclass, the idea of an underclass of human species being expressed there. Omni Jar from New York, USA says, I think we should leave God's work to God. Now, there's a perspective. I wonder what the speakers have to say about that. We've got another one here from Andrew Jose in Georgetown University. And Andrew says, genetic editing can come at the cost of side effects. That might become visible down the line. Disordering natural genetic codes to fix disorders might create more disorders. So that idea that we are tampering with things that we might not know enough about that's being expressed. Just very finally, we've got a question from Sarah Kim. Sarah wants to know who will take the responsibility if gene editing babies are born handicapped. So who will take that responsibility? I wonder if our speakers have something to say about that. Rida, back to you.
I'm sure they will, Nelufar, and we'll come to these questions in a few moments. But let's first see what results we've gotten from our vote. Let's see how much we can actually agree on the question of superhumans and whether they are the future or something to be avoided at all costs. So let's have a look at the results from our online voting. And as you can see, the last position, which was Katie's argument, genetic human enhancement should be strongly rejected, is the one that got more than 50% of the vote, standing there at 51%, followed by Jamie's argument, genetic human enhancement must be carefully guided by values and perhaps regulations as well, 31%. And Julian's position, genetic human enhancement is a moral obligation, just there at 17%. So then, where do we go from here? Let's get into our next phase of this debate.
Welcome to the Mejlis, a traditional Arab consensus building practice. The focus of the Mejlis is to welcome critical conversations and reach solutions. Hida will encourage our speakers to bridge differences and find common ground.
All right, so let's bring in some of your thoughts and ideas, questions into this discussion. But of course, keep them coming as well, and we will get to them when we can. Let me now turn to our speakers, starting with you, Julian. Your position hasn't resonated as much as you might have expected. A lot of people being cautionary, perhaps taking Katie's position. When you look at the evolution of mankind over the millions of years, the last 4, 5, 6 million years, on that time scale, it seems to me that this whole idea of editing genes, altering our DNA, is just perhaps a millisecond old. We just thought about it. Katie's saying, hold off, it's too soon. You're saying, go ahead. Is she taking the more morally responsible position to wait?
Well, I think it is responsible to do proper research and to evaluate the risks and benefits properly. But to choose not to act is also to consign those people to a future that may be very grim. So the idea that there's some deep distinction between disorders like intellectual disability and normality is a purely statistical one. So 2% of people have intellectual disability, an IQ less than 70. But if you've got an IQ between 70 and 85, it's very difficult for you to participate in today's technologically advanced society. You need an IQ of over 90 to complete a tax return. So what used to be good enough for human beings means today it may not be good enough. Now, of course, we can create assistive technology or dumb down technology or change society, but what we have here is the opportunity to uplift the most disadvantaged. So sure, it can increase inequality, but it can also reduce natural inequality. And I think it's very, it's somewhat arrogant to sit here when we're all amongst the most genetically privileged with, our IQs over 120 because we're able to understand this and say, no, other people shouldn't have access to this because we're the lucky ones. Genetics is giving us the opportunity to share that luck with more people.
So Julian wants to share that luck. In fact, he wants to create a more level playing field. Katie, what do you say to that? And what do you say to those who say, as he does, let's try to prevent disease in our children. Let's try to become more immune to viruses like the one we're facing currently. Why not take that opportunity and prevent those types of situations?
I mean, I think the idea that we would level the playing field by having an entrance requirement, an IQ score that you need to be raised to before you can participate in society is a strange idea of equality. I think that, what we should do is focus on creating a society that values people in the range of embodiments and abilities that they have, that we should value diversity in society, and rather than trying to edit out people who don't fit the norms that we have in society, we should try to accommodate.
Who's got it right, Jamie? Julian or Katie?
Well, I luckily am sitting in the middle seat. So with Julian, what I would say is I am the child. My father and grandparents came to the United States as refugees from Nazism. And if you had asked the Nazis what they were doing, they thought they were applying Darwinism. And so when we're thinking about making these choices, and I think you would agree, we just need to be very, very careful and guided by ethics, which I know you are an ethicist. At the same time, to say that we cannot use these technologies, I get that there are some borderline questions on issues like deafness, but imagine that you are parents where one of the parents has cystic fibrosis. So in the old days, before our healthcare improved, that parent would have died before reaching reproductive age. But now, thanks to the miracles of modern science, that parent can reproduce. But cystic fibrosis is an autosomal dominant disorder. And so that means your child is very, very likely, almost certainly, going to have this deadly life sentence disease. And so, yes, on these marginal questions, it's an issue, but even the German Ethics Council, and the German Ethics Council is very careful because they exist in the shadow of Nazism, as I've described, even they have come forward saying that they can imagine cases where heritable germline human genome editing would be applicable and would be ethical. We're not at the level of safety yet. That's why I'm part of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and we've said, hey, wait a second. But there will come a time, sooner rather than later, when we can make these edits. And to say that we could never do it, even though not doing it would guarantee that that future child would die an early, painful death, in my view, is unethical. And so we need to find a middle ground between these two extremes.
A middle ground, as you say, and as the discussion moves from the need to cure disease to the idea of altering our traits and characteristics, Julian, of course we have different cultural norms, values, and standards across the world. Is gene editing then not potentially reinforcing our own racial biases and catering to a certain type of prejudice that already exists in some of us?
Yeah, look, one of the great challenges is what's called ethical relativism, the idea that ethics is just relative to a time or to a culture. And I think what we really need, which we tried to develop with these universal declarations of human rights, is a universal ethic. Now, we're not all the way there, and I agree that some cultures may aim at enhancing traits that may not be ethical at all. And I think there is going to be, a real challenge to identify what these universal traits are. But to give you
But aren't we on a slippery slope there, where we can move back to what Jamie talked about earlier, this new liberal form of eugenics? We saw where that took us in Europe, in the United States in the early 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, look, slippery slopes are everywhere and we need to resist them. So the same thing applies to the creation of social institutions, education, which has been used to brainwash people, laws which have been used to abuse people, and biological interventions are used to control children's behaviour if they're impulsively violent, or to enable them to more likely finish high school, because that's a beneficial thing. There's no difference between genetic enhancements and drugs or social institutions they all act in the end through changing our biology. And what matters are the risks and benefits. And yes, genetic enhancement.
Who decides, though? You talked about the well-being of children, that being the uppermost concern for parents. But let's say you've got a deaf parent who wants to have a child and alter their genes to also have a deaf child to make them part of that community. What would you advise them?
Well, you can already do this as a deaf parent by refusing to have a cochlear implant for your child. So you'll keep your child deaf.
But would you support the idea?
No, I wouldn't, because I agree, and I've just written a paper arguing that all children in primary school should be taught sign language as their first, second language, because that would reduce the disadvantage that deaf people face, but it wouldn't eliminate all of the disadvantages they face. You still won't be able to hear auditory warnings, you won't be able to experience music. So being able to hear means you can be a part of the deaf community by learning to sign, and also being a part of a hearing community, so you have more choice. You can choose to become deaf.
But again,
later in
whose
life.
values, Katie? Would we be passing judgment based on our values on what the well-being of some people is?
I'd like to go back a little bit, actually, to talk about the idea that that we absolutely must go ahead with germline editing in order to prevent disease. There are very few cases that you can't prevent the transmission of genetic diseases without embryo selection. And even in those cases, like the ones that Jamie brings up, in every case, parents can adopt, parents can use donated eggs or sperm in order to have a child who's unaffected by this condition. And so the benefit that's being provided or promised with germline editing is actually the genetic relationship to both parents. And that's a social benefit. That isn't a medical benefit, and it takes it out of the question of whether we're going to use an individual patient medical risk and benefit analysis, and brings us into needing to talk about the ways that this could affect society.
There's two justifications for gene editing for diseases. The first one is that some people have moral objections to destroying embryos and genetic selection. So they'll only form one embryo, and if that embryo has a genetic disorder, gene editing is a cure for that individual. It's like saying, I'm going to cure your cystic fibrosis with a pill, but I'm going to do it in every cell in your body through gene editing. The other point is that for polygenic dispositions to disease, which are most of the dispositions we all have, where you have 50, 100, 200, 300 genes involved, you can't do genetic selection unless you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of embryos and you're prepared to destroy those.
What do you mean by polygenic?
So many, many genes. So, for example, schizophrenia will have hundreds of genes involved. So you can't do selection. You can't choose from 10 embryos which one is going to be less disposed to getting schizophrenia. You're going to have to do gene editing across many different sites. So that you can't use genetic selection for that. Well, so this whole idea that we don't need it is...
What about mistakes then happening?
Yeah, so let me address this, and answer your question as quickly as possible. So that's why in my remarks I talked about embryo selection. I think that embryo selection is going to be the primary mechanism for the application of genetic technologies to procreation, because of this complexity. But there's a new mathematical model, technically a new science, called polygenic scoring, that are going to allow us to roughly rank embryos based on whatever criteria are established. It won't be binary, as is the case with a single gene mutation disorder, but we'll be able to roughly rank them. And as we build these massive data sets of genetic and life information that we billions of people, we're going to be able to understand more and more. I don't think we're going to be, for a very long time, making multiple changes to an embryo, but we'll make small ones. And you, and Katie, in your remarks, you talked about that it's a social construct that people want to be genetically related to their children. Well, maybe it is. When you look across the animal kingdom, there's not that much adoption. There's some. So I think that's a value system. And my whole point, and then I'll get to your question, is that we need a process, a political process. We live in political environments where there are lots of people with different views, and we bring people together to find compromises that work for everybody. That's why we're here. Yes, mistakes are a big issue, which is why there needs to be a level of efficacy and accountability and transparency when making decisions about what's the right way to move forward. And there are regulatory models around the world. The UK, in my mind, is the best example in the world, where there are regulatory bodies and governments and accountable parliaments that are working on these issues. So rather than saying we're going to have an absolute ban when the benefits, in my mind, are clear, and rather than, if this is what you're saying, we should say kind of let's open the door, we need to have a political process like we do with every technology to figure out how to
Who is going to be at that table? Again,
so everybody,
to Katie's point about creating inequalities, the haves and have-nots, who makes those decisions?
So one is we need a political process that includes everybody. That's on a national and an international level. And the issue of haves and have-nots, I totally agree. That's one potential outcome. If we don't want that outcome, we better start organizing for a different outcome, because people who are so concerned about these genetic haves and have-nots in the future should be equally concerned about the difference between the prospects for all of our children and the children, for example, of those people who are born in the middle of a war zone in the Central African Republic, because due to and poor healthcare infrastructure, those kids are born with a mental capacity that is not the same as our kids. And so we need to address that so we know who we are when we get to the future.
But that sounds perfect in theory, but in practice, Katie, to you briefly, can you see this fair and equal distribution of technology and decision-making when it comes to this?
Right. I think having a broad public conversation is something that I agree that we need. But that needs to be a meaningful conversation, and it can't be one where we've already skipped over the question of whether we should use this at all and decided that we should, and then move on to how, or to give people, right, in this discussion, limited ways to sort of shape the way that it's used or not used. But, you know, this decision about whether to go forward is one that really belongs to all of us. And so to have this conversation go ahead when this fundamental decision has already been made really cuts out part of that decision-making process.
You say it's a decision that belongs to all of us, but if we engage in these endless meetings and policy papers, and I know you work for the Center for Genetics and Society in the US, if we engage in these endless meetings, would we ever have made the advances that we've made, the technological advances? I mean, would we be driving Teslas today? Would we still be driving our Flintstones cars, Flintstones mobiles? I mean, would we have moved this far?
As you said a moment ago, really, the time in which we're even considering this or think that we have the tools to be able to make these edits is just a millisecond, a blip in the broader length of time that we have. And so I think that we do need to take some time, stop here while there is a line that we can draw clearly and defend, rather than getting to this point where we're saying, yes, we'll cross the line, and then we'll figure out over time which things can be used and which can't.
So can I just say that I think you've got to put this
just
into
briefly,
context.
and then we'll bring in our connector to see where we can actually agree on something.
I mean, we already have legislation in many European countries, including the United Kingdom, which allows selection against diseases. So you can select for this disorder called XXX, where you've got 3 X chromosomes instead of 2. And that means you've got 20 IQ points less. What you're not allowed to do is to do a polygenic score that shows you're going to have 20 IQ points less than average, because that's enhancement. And the effects are exactly the same, except one just has a name and the other one, you know, as a disease, and the other one doesn't. So we're already moving within the realm of enhancement, so that what we need to do is decide what should be the principles that govern this, and if it has a big effect on somebody's life prospects, then we can add it to the list, just as we add new genetic disorders to the list of things you can test for in the UK. Now, the US doesn't have any regulation at all. It's a capitalist, libertarian free-for-all. That's a different environment, but not everywhere is the US.
All right, let's see if we can find any consensus on this issue. Let's now bring in our connector.
Dr. Govinda Clayton is a senior researcher in peace processes within the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. Dr. Clayton's research interests include negotiation, mediation, conflict management, and civil war. As our connector, Dr. Clayton will provide guidance on identifying common ground and steering towards bridge building and consensus.
Govinda, share with us some of your superhuman wisdom. Can we really agree on any of this here?
Thanks a lot. So, as is clear from my very extravagant introduction, I'm from the world of conflict management and consensus building, not genetics. But some of the problems that we're really facing here today are very similar to those that I see in my work all the time. Firstly, When you get three experts together on any topic, it's only natural that you tend to gravitate towards your extremes and highlight those areas in which you have very different understandings. When actually, there's probably a whole realm of areas in which you actually have a common understanding, but don't necessarily bring those out. So let me stress perhaps a couple of areas that I've already observed. Firstly, it seems that the whole field that we're talking about today with genetic editing and kind of human engineering has already moved significantly further than most people would generally understand. And so the discussion seems to be resolving much more around whether we should be undertaking certain processes rather than whether we could do them at all. Secondly, I think you've all touched on a range of different risks that are all very much associated with this process. So that's included both biological risks, but also in particular the social risks associated with this. So while clearly there's very different understandings about how you weigh those certain risks, you all tend to agree that these risks do exist. But now we're in the Majlis, and this is a Doha debate, not an Oxford-style debate. So we're not necessarily looking to accentuate just those areas of differences, but instead try and zoom in a little on potential areas of consensus. So what I'd really invite you all to do as we move into the next section of the discussion is to look for those areas in which, as Jamie suggested, we might be able to find some kind of middle ground. So not those solutions where you would all prefer us to be, but areas in which you might agree. So, for example, are there different regulations, bodies or conversations that we need to be having as a society that you think you can all rally around and support? Because I think for non-experts like myself and many of the people watching at home, it'd be great to know what we should be supporting as a society.
All right, Govinda, thanks very much for these tips and words of advice. I want to go first to Katie, if I can. Katie, if it's no longer an issue of if, but when we move towards the application of this new technology, would you then sit down with Julian and discuss ways to make this accessible to the biggest number of people around the world?
I would still hold this line that we should not go ahead with germline editing, with changing the genes of future generations.
And why not?
I don't think that there's any way that this could be accessible. But even the accessibility issue, I mean, I don't think that it's a better situation when we have more access to using this technology to alter our children's traits as they're conceived. And I think that, you know, already the question of values and what we're valuing, we can see how it's happening on this stage, that narrows down. There's this focus on, for example, IQ over and over, when IQ is one way to think about and measure how people value and how they participate in this world. So the idea that we should focus on that and be choosing future children and designing future children to focus on this one trait chosen out of so many other ways that we could define a person's value and measured in this one particular way, put on a scale with points, I think is already narrowing the conversation and reducing the chances that we could build a really fair and inclusive society.
But it isn't just about traits, is it? It's about increasing their IQs, which we know would also give them more well-being in life, and also preventing disease, being preemptive. Wouldn't it be immoral, in fact, to simply sit back and say, well, let nature continue to roll the dice?
We have other ways that we can try to prevent the transmission of genetic diseases, and we also have a whole range of tools that we can use gene editing for. I'm not opposed to using gene editing, but we could really focus on developing somatic gene therapies for issues that we would like to treat and benefit patients who are already here.
Julian doesn't seem to be buying this.
Well,
how would you convince Katie?
So, I mean, I think it's important to put this into context. It costs about $1 million a year to treat somebody, $1 million over a lifetime to treat somebody with cystic fibrosis. Okay, genetic disorders are extremely expensive to treat. It costs about $5,000 to do gene editing. You do it once and it's over. It affects every cell in the body. So germline gene editing is extremely cost-effective when it comes to making changes.
But it comes at a cost. There are lots of ethical questions that it raises.
Is it what?
It's at a cost.
Well, the cost will be $5,000 plus whatever the risks are. Now,
Not the financial cost, but the ethical cost.
Well, the ethical costs are what they are in a particular context. I don't see what the ethical costs are of curing somebody of cystic fibrosis with a one-hit gene edit. So somatic gene therapy, Katie raised, has been hopeless as a therapy, because with somatic gene therapy, you have to try to get the gene using a virus into billions of cells accurately. With gene editing of an embryo, you have to do it once on one cell. So somatic gene therapy works for small numbers of cells like white cells in cancer, where you just have to change a few. It's a hopeless way of treating something like cystic fibrosis, and it's a hopeless way of dealing with something that results in intellectual disability as development occurs. So you have to intervene early and in all the cells. That's why this is irresistible. The Chinese are spending billions trying to understand the genetics of intelligence. And the reason is, they're not particularly concerned about the individuals, it's also good for society. And the US military has estimated that if you just enhance the IQ of the working population by a few points, a few percent, you'd have the same effects as the introduction of the internet. So
the Chinese are investing a lot in this, Jamie. They're forging ahead. A Chinese scientist is in prison for giving life to twins who were genetically engineered. We've got a scientist in Russia saying, he's going to push ahead as well. There are more regulations in Europe and the United States than there are in other countries. Who is winning this race, and what does it mean to actually win it?
Really, really great question. So let me answer your question. I'm going to try to do a lot of things very quickly at the same time. So there is a competitive race between the two leading competitive innovation ecosystems in the world, which is the greater US ecosystem and the greater China ecosystem. That doesn't mean that everybody else isn't innovating. And if we're not careful, this question of the future of human life is going to be just another piece of this big power competition. And we shouldn't want that, and we don't want that, even though there are some good things that come from that. And then coming back to what Katie was saying, I totally agree that we need an empowered, global, inclusive conversation. And that's really why I was a little bit confused, because you said, let's pause and have a conversation and then make a decision. And then you were saying, whatever the decision is, we can't go forward with germline editing. But still, I think there is a real opportunity for common ground here. I think we would all agree that whatever steps are taken, there has to be a broad public engagement, education, empowerment, consultation, and we need to be open-minded about different outcomes. We need a process that is inclusive, both within societies and between societies. Every country in the world needs to have a regulatory infrastructure based both on international best practices and on the particular cultures and traditions and values of that country. And you mentioned these meetings and meetings. With climate change, there are a lot of meetings, and maybe they're not doing enough. On these issues, there really aren't the meetings. This infrastructure doesn't exist, and that's why forums like this are so essential, because it can catalyze individuals, governments to say, hey, this is really important. This future is coming at us sooner than we think. Let's build these kinds of infrastructures so that we can move forward inclusively and ethically.
And it isn't just parents potentially debating what they should do, but it's entire countries, governments deciding what they might do within their own wider society. A question to you both, Jamie and Julian. Would you consider a moratorium on this for a while? And what do you say to Katie's point that it is going to make us as human society less tolerant, because anyone who doesn't fit into that super race will be left out?
Look, all-powerful technology can increase inequality, and it can create intolerance. So the internet can create ghettos. Computing, artificial intelligence can radically enhance inequality. So this isn't a problem unique to genetics. And the idea
would you agree on a moratorium until society has a clear answer?
I think a moratorium is just sticking your head in the sand. We need to do the hard ethical work of thinking, what would be the pathway? What are our values? How can this be used to achieve our values? So I've given a translational pathway for first-in-human trials of gene editing. What was wrong with He Jiankui's Chinese experiment was he took normal embryos and exposed them to unnecessary risks. If he'd taken an embryo with a lethal condition like Tay-Sachs disease, that embryo would have only stood to gain and would have stood to lose nothing. That would have been a more ethical experiment. So that's the sort of discussion we should be having, not saying we're not going to do this because we don't know what we're going to do. When will we know what we're going to do?
Not everyone knows what we're going to do. Most people don't. Katie, you're sticking your head in the sand.
Well, how are we going to have these conversations if scientists are just running ahead with the way that they're going, right? This isn't something that scientists can answer. And this is a really critical point. It's, maybe our last chance to really take the time and stop, not cross this line, and then really have a societal conversation where we talk about the values that we have that could guide our decision here, and to really focus on, the kind of society that we want to build, the ways that we can increase equality, fairness, inclusiveness, in ways that don't involve editing out people who don't.
Are we at a point of no return, Jamie?
We definitely are at a point of no return, but that doesn't mean that we're going to move forward in any which way. I mean, the debate that we have to urgently have now is how we can apply our most sacred ethical values and traditions to this very powerful technology. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and we have publicly stated that this science is not yet ready. But it will be, and it will be soon. And moratorium or not, I had a piece in the Financial Times against a moratorium, but that doesn't mean all systems go, just do whatever. There is a race. The science is advancing exponentially. Whatever we do, it's going to happen. Even if we declare a moratorium, the He Jiankuis of the world, the Rebrikovs in Russia of the world, and others like them are likely to move forward. So rather than throwing all of our energy into creating a moratorium that probably won't even work, what we should be doing is saying, for the long term, what are the values and principles that we want to guide these technologies? What are the processes that we can set up that can balance these interests? And we've done it before. Julian mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this establishment of a whole series of norms and values and principles in the aftermath of the Second World War, for nuclear and chemical and biological weapons, for climate change. We've built up these kinds of processes that can facilitate these kinds of
dialogues. We still have nuclear bombs, we still have wars.
Yes, but it could have been much worse. And we aren't going to just say that this one of the most powerful technologies in human history, we're just not going to use it in ways that could actually save the lives of some people.
But you'll always have something new. You'll always have a new coronavirus that we never heard of before.
No, it's true. I'm not saying every application. I just think that to choose not to use these technologies in any circumstances is to condemn these poor, innocent children to incredibly painful deaths.
Would you take a pause, though, a moratorium, maybe 2 years?
No, but because
maybe less.
What we need to do is be very careful. And again, our committee has said we're not ready for this. So there's what is being paused. I think pause is not the issue. We need to race to set up the infrastructure that can guide this process. And let's just say we today declare there's a moratorium for 2 years. Who is declaring that moratorium? What enforcement capacity? We don't have an institution set up to do it. So a bunch of people, ethicists, feel better, some ethicists, that we've declared this moratorium. But it doesn't help anything because the people who want to do this are very likely going to do it anyway. I think it's much better to try to build an inclusive system, to try to find these norms and values and translate those into regulations and laws on the national and international
Say
level.
Inclusive, but again, who's going to drive this? Whose values are going to be at the forefront? Julian, is it going to be the Western values, Western supremacy again, guiding this?
Look, again, this is a deep problem, but it's a problem that applies to climate change, it applies to drones, it applies to artificial intelligence, it applies to all powerful technology. Yes, it's tough. Yes, there are big risks. Yes, there are big benefits. Yes, there are contested values. But the alternative is to do nothing. And we can surely do better than nothing, or that's an extremely pessimistic view of human ethical capacity. I think our challenge is to step up and do better than we have done in the past, and to try to go through the processes that Jamie says. And of course we may not get it right, but the alternative comes with big costs as well.
You do sound pessimistic. You have a pessimistic outlook on life. You've written about it. You say this is bound to end badly, yet we do have a host of young people and students around the world watching us. This is their future. Whatever decisions are made today by this generation will impact them. What can you say to them to reassure them?
You know, the decisions we've made to develop social media and internet technology and radically change our social environments in ways that, in a blink of an eye, that are much greater than ever through human history, are going to change the next generation too. So I haven't said that the enhancement of human beings is going to end badly. What I've said is going to end badly is the misuse by current human beings of biological technology, the ability to build a smallpox virus in a backyard laboratory, which you can do with a few $1,000s. 1 out of 7 billion people does that, and you think coronavirus is bad, that will potentially wipe out humanity. That's the big risk, not genetically modifying human beings.
Katie, can you agree with anything that Julian has said?
I would say not pursuing germline editing is not doing nothing. It's using tools that we already have. It's developing treatments for patients who are here now, rather than attempting to create future people who have traits that we want or who can avoid. And it's also taking the opportunity to say, you know, we can stop here. We have these technologies that have raced ahead of our abilities to put in place controls on them, but we really have an opportunity here to say, this is a technology that is extremely likely to increase inequality, that once we start using it for any reason, could be used for almost every.
But again, isn't it worth exploring? You don't know that for a fact. If we hadn't taken risks all these many years ago, would we be here today?
And this whole slippery slope argument, it's like, oh, geez, I may ask this person out for a date. Oh no, there may be a slippery slope to marriage. I mean, it's not a slippery, everything is on a slippery slope. The question is, where is the slippery slope sliding, if that's to use that alliteration? And that's why we have to be thinking about how do we integrate our values and ethics into these conversations now. If we just say we can't even start, then there are costs to that. And not only that, our values will have a much harder time weaving into this conversation, because if you just say, all right, we're stopping everything, a lot of this is going to go on anyway. Let's influence everything from now.
All right, let's get your final statements on this. Let me start with you, Katie. Where do you see this going forward? What would you say to young people watching, listening?
I would say we really do need to focus on what kind of society that we want to build, the ways that we can increase fairness and inclusivity, and not pursue this incredibly risky tool, this solution in search of a problem that could lead to more inequality and reduce the ways that we can value people in our society who are
Your advice for us and the young generation?
Yeah, these are very, very powerful technologies, but this is not a conversation about technology. It's not a conversation about science. It's a conversation about ethics. And if we want to make sure that our most sacred ethical traditions guide the application of our most powerful technologies, we all need to roll up our sleeves and weigh in, because life is not simple. It doesn't lend itself to an absolute yes or an absolute no. These are really powerful technologies. We need to weigh the risks and the benefits and make sure that every little step we're taking is carefully considered and thoughtful.
Julian.
Well, just to find some points of consensus. So I think we all agree there are significant risks that need a lot of study before this is employed. I think we're all concerned about increasing inequality. We're also, I think, all concerned about the sort of society we create and how inclusive it is. But nobody is arguing that all of our resources should go into gene editing, or this should be done to the exclusion of interventions now to make people's lives go better now, or social interventions or psychological interventions. So I think we also all agree that we need regulation, and we all agree that regulation should be based on some process and based on ethics and values. I've tried to argue that Regulation today is based on whether something is a disease or not. And I've tried to argue that that's not all that's important, that human well-being is important, and genes have some contribution to play. Now, that might not be the end point of our regulations, but at least it's a place to start. And I think the idea that we can either ban this or give it a laissez-faire, I think at least Jamie and I are agreed, are both untenable. The middle position is to adopt some form of regulation and to use values to inform that regulation.
Well, to many, this might still sound like science fiction. For others, not so much. But it is a good
Well, it happens, you know, with He Jiankui, so it's not science fiction, it's already happened.
We're getting there, whether we like it or not, Katie. So thank you very much for exploring these different perspectives and trying to find some common ground. And I think we did achieve one or two bits of commonalities here and got closer to each other's perspectives. We'll continue the conversation online, but for now, let me thank you all very much indeed. Julian, Jamie, and Katie, thank you for sharing your perspectives. Before we go, though, I think we should do one more thing, which is let's try to test the water one more time, see whether the needle has shifted in any significant way based on everything you said here today. So let's do a quick second round of voting. You know where to go. dohadebates.com/vote. dohadebates.com/vote. Let us know what you think. And perhaps I can bring in Nelufar if she's standing by. Nell, are you there? Can you tell us what is going on online?
Oh, Rida, it is absolutely heating up online. Our speakers are making so many important and quite riveting points, actually, and there seems to be clear camps forming around two very different perspectives. So let me just read a few comments after I tell you about the ways that you can get in touch with us. As ever, there's Twitter and Facebook. We are at Doha Debates. Use the hashtag #DearWorld with all the amazing comments that you've been sending in. I am keeping on top of it. Remember, you can send us a video of how you're feeling. There's lots of passionate pleas being made for you on that debate stage. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a question you need answered? Go straight to Instagram. Once you're there, make sure that you send us a direct message. And that's very simple. You have to click on the little paper aeroplane that you will see. Once you've done that, search for us. We are Doha Debates. Once you're in there, click the blue button with the camera logo and record yourself. We'll be glad to see what you have to say. You've got just a little bit of time left if you want to send us a direct message via Instagram, so get those videos in. Now, Rida, you asked, so I shall tell you. There is just comment after comment about how humanity itself is asking godlike questions. That seems to be a theme that's emerging. I'm going to read you a couple of contradicting perspectives coming out of England. One from Stephanie Vallis. Stephanie says, what right do we have to choose on someone else's behalf who they will be using... what right do we have to choose on someone else's behalf who they will be by using a process that may have wildly unpredictable results when used on a person? So what right do we have to make these choices? Tom Charrier in England disagrees. Tom makes a point. What? You've not seen any superhero movies? Tom asks. They always win. Surely it would be like that. Sanaz Habibi in Stockholm, Sweden, makes a point. Honestly, I disagree with all of their arguments, and I also disagree with them. The question is fundamentally ethical. But when has ethics ever completely stopped the advancement of through science and technology? That's a really good point. I wonder if our speakers can talk to that. Rida, back to you.
Nelufar, thank you very much indeed. And I hear that we do have the results of our second round of voting. So let's go ahead and put on the screen behind me the first set of results. So this is what we got earlier when we took a vote. We had Katie's position being the one that resonated the most. Not so much anymore. Still the case, in fact, but percentage-wise, Katie's position has gone down. I see Julian celebrating. Let's see, that was argument number one. Genetic human enhancement is a moral obligation. You've gone up from 17% to 25.5%. What do you think swayed the angle there for you, for people watching?
Well, let me just put this in context. Most people are against this. So, those figures at the beginning are very typical of population surveys about human enhancement. And I think once you start to understand how we already employ various different kinds of human enhancement and understand more about the facts, some people tend to shift, not many, But I think that's quite a big shift myself. Usually people are very entrenched in their moral positions. But I think that part of the challenge of this debate, we heard about greater public involvement. It's very difficult. We haven't even covered the real facts. In fact, Jamie made a slight mistake when he said cystic fibrosis is autosomal dominant. There's lots of complicated facts about this debate, and in order to have these proper debates requires an enormous amount of education, which I don't think is achievable today.
Jamie, an enormous amount of education. You scored pretty well, 36% there with the audience, that middle position. But one thing we did not specifically talk about when it comes to the ethical issues surrounding this discussion is, aren't we commodifying our future children? Are we going down that slippery path of creating some kind of a Starbucks culture where we will order our kids down to every detail, size, flavor, you name it?
People have this fantasy that what we're talking about is the equivalent of going to the Build-A-Bear showroom in your local mall, and you just kind of pick a bunch of traits and press a button, and then a kid comes out of the vending machine. That's not, human biology is so incredibly complex. What we're talking about is, at least in the ideal scenario, making first a small number of informed or semi-informed decisions about which of your 10 or 15 pre-implanted embryos in a dish will be implanted. Maybe on top of that, making a very small and discrete number of genome edits to remove some very considerable risks. Yes, there is a possibility in a longer period of time that we could be making all those big changes, but the fact that something could be abused when you play it out ad infinitum can't be an argument to not carefully use it now. And that's why we need a thoughtful, inclusive conversation and a smart regulatory infrastructure. And we know that it can be done because the United Kingdom is doing it right now.
And Katie, that seems to be what you're advocating for and what has resonated with most viewers.
Well, I think the example here the examples that we have of technologies that have gone ahead have headed straight towards this commodified version of them, right? Even the three-person IVF technique that Jamie's mentioned, the way that it's regulated in the UK, outside of the UK has already gone from, its stated intention to be used for treating mitochondrial disease to generally being used for infertility. We've seen examples over and over of the ways that the promise in the beginning is this very targeted use in very compelling cases, and almost immediately, once it's approved and in use, it moves on to these broader categories and heads towards a commodified version of it, because that's where the bigger market is.
But how could it be commodified if somebody, you mentioned infertility, loving parents who want to have a child, who can't, who have a technology that helps them have a child, I think we should...
But to help them have a particular kind of child.
Their own child that lives.
I hate to interrupt you, but we'll stop our debate here. We'll continue the conversation online. One word or two.
Can I say one about playing God? Many people brought up this playing God objection. We play God every time we engage in medicine and science. Vaccination is playing God. Giving women pain relief in labour is playing God. Treating cancer is playing God. The question is, how are we going to play God? The plausibility in the playing God objection is that often we go in without adequate knowledge of a complicated system, like the way that we've messed up the environment and the way that we may mess up human beings. The answer to that is to do more scientific research. It's not to put our heads in the sands and have a moratorium. It's actually to do responsible science, and that's what this area needs.
Responsible science that will still raise concerns among the more religiously conservative societies.
And it should
object to this, but
it should raise those concerns. Those are healthy concerns. These are healthy concerns. We need to have a majlis that brings everybody together so we can move forward together. We are all one species. We can't say there's not a seat for everyone. There has to be a seat for everyone, and that's why these kinds of conversations are so helpful.
Healthy debate. Thank you very much for being part of this. Katie Hassan, Jamie Metzel, and Julian Savadescu, thank you all very much indeed. And of course, thank you to our audience who joined us online and stayed with us for this debate, sent us questions, and voted to give us their thoughts and perspectives on this. Thank you, of course, as well to Northwestern University here in Qatar, the students who couldn't be here today physically in person, but who we hope we will have with us next time. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to the Qatar Foundation. Stay with us for our post-show, which begins just now after this debate ends. And of course, the conversation, as I said, will continue online on Instagram, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Do share your thoughts using the hashtag #DearWorld at Doha Debates. We will be back again in the fall for the start of season 2 with new debates. We hope you'll join us then. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire Doha Debates team, thanks very much for being with us.
Hi, hello, and welcome to the post show. Don't go anywhere. Oh my goodness. So much happened on that debate stage. So many important, crucial, and passionate points made. Guys, we are going to go through the whole thing. I've got a lot coming your way, including my very special guest who will be joining me in a bit. Also, we've got my students who are going to be joining me via the internet. Of course, there's lots coming your way. The coronavirus has made an impact on the show at large, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to get your comments, your videos, and your information through. First of all, though, let's take a very quick look at that final result that came through. I mean, it was decisive, I think. 38.33% genetic human enhancement should be strongly rejected. You know, the vote did change quite considerably, though. Genetic human enhancement must be carefully guided by values came in at 36%. So those numbers are interesting, but they can change. You can change them. The vote is still open and will be until the end of this post show. Just get online, dohadebates.com/vote. I will be there looking to see how you make those numbers move. Now, as ever, this is supposed to be a global conversation, and I need you to participate. And the best way to do that is to reach us via all our socials. We are on Facebook, on Twitter. We are at Doha Debates. Use that hashtag #DearWorld, and I will more readily be able to find your answers. But where are you in this world, I wonder? Well, you guys are watching us and streaming us on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, and everywhere else. I just want to take a quick look at the locations that you guys are coming to us from. You're speaking to us and engaging with us from Nigeria, from Afghanistan, Ghana, Sweden, Poland. Thank you guys for tuning in. We've also got people watching on Twitter from Turkey, the US, Brazil, Spain, and where I live, the UK. I'm very glad to be having you here. A lot of debriefing that needs to go on, but before any of that, I want to go straight to my students who would usually be in the studio but can't make it. They're joining us live via the wonders of the internet. I can't wait to get them online. I hear that. I think they're all coming online now. But remember, guys, the most important thing in the debate that was raised was this idea of solutions. That is what the Doha Debates ethos is all about. We want to find commonality and common ground, and you guys were sending in comments and questions that seem to really cover the breadth of the discussion. Now, I'm going to be joined by the students right now. Are you guys standing by? Do I have my students? Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Mayasa and Abdul Fattah. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
So very quickly, because I'm going to come to you later on in the show, I want your hot takes. Hayam, you tell me first, what did you make of that debate?
Well, I think that not doing it or doing it shouldn't be the question. It's the matter of where you draw the line.
Very good.
So
Abdul
I
Fattah.
agree with the second speaker.
Abdul Fattah, what did you think?
I think debate is very enlightening and it's engaging. Like the speakers, they came closer to a solution. So I think it's very enlightening.
Okay, Mayasa, what about you? What did you make of the whole thing? Which solution did you agree with?
Yeah, I agree with Yam. I think it's about how we're going to control and regulate it.
Good, very good. Thank you, guys. Now, will you stay on the line for me? I'm going to come back to you. But first of all, there's someone who was in the debate that I am absolutely desperate to talk to. Govinda, it seems I'm always running to get the hot take from you as well. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. That was intense.
It was very intense.
It was intense.
You know what? It's always difficult for me to watch scientists because I think they can be so academic. They can sometimes be quite difficult to understand. But these guys, they were coming and speaking from the heart, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they were very eloquent and they presented
the very technical elements in a way that we could all understand. So I think that was great and made it accessible for all of us who obviously don't have a background in genetics.
Of course. Now, you got onto that stage and you were quite compelling, I thought. You were trying to find consensus. Do you think that they listened to you? Were they kind of trying to do that, although they found it quite difficult?
Yeah, I think there was way more points of consensus than was necessarily coming out throughout the discussion. And I actually think Julian did a great job at the end of summarising those points and highlighting a number of the areas that I touched on as well. And Jamie, actually, I think it's telling that he got the biggest swing in terms of the movement of the needle in the votes, and he was really stressing the commonalities across the different positions.
He seemed to be like tugging from both sides.
Absolutely.
I felt he was taking your plea of coming together to heart. I guess my main concern when it's something so hypothetical, when we're talking in the realm of ideas, is bringing it back down to reality. You deal with negotiations, you deal with people who are often having to make really complex connections and ideas that seem lofty. How do we go about having a discussion that brings these things to the ground, that brings them to reality?
Yeah, it's a really great question, actually, and we actually saw some great examples of this in the debate today. So when we were talking about the more abstract ethical principles, it was easy to get lost, and it was easy for the different speakers to sit in their own little camps and not find any common ground across each other. But when they got specific and they said, you know, do the type of approaches that Jamie was suggesting, so should we set up these boards or should we have these types of regulation, then there was much more movement together. So absolutely getting specific and looking at things that perform multiple functions is one way we can find this agreement.
My favourite thing is when you made your way here to the post-show, you were kind of almost like cheering them on, like, come on guys, you could do it, you could find this commonality. You really cared about this.
Yeah, it was there. It was, you could hear the commonalities, and I tried to point them towards it in my discussion. But the trouble is that when you have experts, they're always going to zero in on these different differences that they have, and we could see that people kept moving back into their camps. And so
it didn't go beyond my noticing when Julian did finally win the debate. You saw the big.
Yeah, he was celebrating. So.
He was celebrating big time. I've got a comment in here to you, Gov, from Dan Mensah in Ghana. And Dan tweets, a common ground must be agreed before moving forward. The idea of genetic manipulation being natural or unnatural depends on where you stand and has its pros and cons, just like anything else. Is that just a bit wishy-washy? Is that wishy-washy from Dan, or is that the right approach?
So I'd say yeah and no. So on the one hand, it's really important that we share some kind of common goal before we enter into a dialogue. And I think this is the point that Julian was actually making throughout the discussion about the need to agree on human well-being as this overarching principle. But at the same time, if we get stuck trying to negotiate a goal that we can all agree, it can mean that we miss out on the possibilities for consensus in smaller areas as well.
Absolutely. Well, you're bringing us back down to reality for sure. Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Gov is what I call him, but Dr. Clayton is what he is. Now, we wanted to know what everyone thinks from around the world, and as you guys have been commenting and tweeting, Facebooking, watching us on YouTube, thank you for sticking around. I will get to your comments in a sec. But first, Gov, we sent a camera person out to the streets of Mexico City, Kigali, and Reykjavik, and we asked one very simple question. Where should we draw the line when it comes to gene editing? This is what they had to say.
I think it should be only for health.
After diseases, stop there kind of thing. Don't make it about aesthetics.
They shouldn't allow the kids to do so, because I could follow the peer pressure. I found all my friends, they are looking blonde and they want to be blonde like them, and they go for this.
I think as humans we don't know to draw lines.
We don't know where to draw lines. Nawal Akram, thank you for being my very special guest on the show. We've been sat here basically just kind of like talking shop about what all those speakers had to say. But you are a disability rights activist, you're a campaigner, you're a comedian, and you're someone who's personally affected by this entire discussion. First of all, I need to know, was that satisfying? Was that compelling? Were you moved by what you saw? Be honest, I don't want you to filter this.
No, I'm seeing that people do want to help us, but the thing is, a lot of them being in our name, that will be used against us, meaning we might not be able to afford what is for us, and only the wealthy might use it to create what they like, right? Even right now, there's some things available, medicine available, but it's built in our name of people with disabilities when we are not able to afford it, right? And a lot of these things, time and research is done for the future. But right now, so many people with disabilities with these conditions cannot afford the medicine. We cannot afford healthcare. We cannot afford education because society is against us.
Now, I don't know, Julian made a really fair point. Supporting someone who has a specific genetic affliction or is living with a genetic condition could cost $1 million over a year, whereas editing the gene out might be really quick and cost a few $100,000. What do you think about that?
The real question is, why is it costing $1 million to afford something that we really need? Why does it cost that much? When realistically, even with different conditions, what is available?
Fact, you agree with Katie? Would that be fair to say? Because I could see when we were watching the show together, you seemed to get quite frustrated a few times. What was frustrating you?
Because a lot of it is done hypothetically, what will be in the future, and it's done for the future. What about us? We live with it right now. If someone is coming telling me, well, my condition, I will die by 40 years old. Someone telling me that, oh, in the future, we're developing all this stuff right now, but right now they cannot do anything to accommodate me. What does that realistically leave me? That's the question, right? And also, this technology will be going forward, regardless of how much so many people are against it.
Is it inevitable?
Possible, yeah. As humans, we exploit everything.
Oh, gosh.
That is there. So where are we putting regulations? Where are we putting the line, right?
Right.
I know that not every parent can emotionally give and financially give that attention to a child for the entire lifetime if they have a condition. I totally agree with that. But making it for the wealthy to make a designer child, I'm against it.
So let me ask you then. I know you don't like hypotheticals, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you one anyway. Hypothetically, you are able to have a baby. And this baby that you're able to have it has got the same genetic condition that you have, muscular dystrophy, and you could snip, snip, that gene is gone. It's out. Would you do it?
I think if I lived in a world where my child wouldn't be discriminated and had affordable medical care, I wouldn't mind. But if it was in a world where it keeps discriminating my child and instead of accommodating my child, but keeps discriminating my child, of course I wouldn't want it. That's why I'm in the middle of all of this.
Which world do we live in, Nawal? Which world do we live in?
Honestly, we don't live in a world that accommodates us. They use people with disabilities.
So then you would CRISPR out the gene that gave you muscular dystrophy for your child. Is that what you're saying?
Most probably, yeah.
How does that make you feel when you consider that to be?
Because I haven't had education because of my disability. I'm not able to afford certain medical care just because of my condition and because people want to profit off of my disability instead of accommodate it. So this is a very big question that we bring in. This technology will be going forward, but where do we draw the line? That's regulations.
No, I could talk to you for absolutely hours, and I have been off camera, but thank you. Your perspective and your points are absolutely crucial to us. Thank you so much. I just want to get to a couple of the social comments. Tell me what you think about this. Bukala Christiana in Ekiti, Nigeria, sends us this comment. If you can save lives and improve survival chances with genetic human enhancement, then I'd go with option 2. People already do plastic surgery anyway. Can we improve more? If we can, then we could give it a try. I've got another one here from Mehvash. Mehvash Amin, I think is how you pronounce that, in Lahore, Pakistan. And Mehvash says, let's just try to control the global coronavirus pandemic and then focus our resources on being superhuman. That's a point you raised really eloquently. Resources are sparse.
Yeah.
Why should we waste them on all these hypothetical? I'm going to read one more. Hollins Esigba is in Wari, Nigeria, and says there is a path which, when taken, can never be rescinded. This is a really important point. I agree that technology continues to advance, but we should not advance without it. How about we focus on improved ways to reduce poverty, hunger, and starvation? Nawal, thank you so much. It is time now to go to the students who have been waiting patiently. I'm going to get right back over there, which is where they're going to be. Are you guys standing by?
Yes.
Okay, Abdul Fattah, I want to start with you. I want to understand from your perspective, which of those solutions do you think is the winner? Because our audience watching online are still voting. So which of these do you think is the best one? Which one of them convinced you?
Actually, the solution that really captivates my attention was the solution about legislation. Dr. Jamie really explained how the political process can actually work out, how the political process can ensure transparency in the way the laws and regulations are being laid out. But then I have a problem on how these laws actually played out in reality, because in theory everything looks very good, everything looks very nice, like in theory, but in practical, let's take an example of climate change. We've been in the process of legislation for a long period of time just to pass the Green New Deal. Then, if we just put the gene editing to the process, it will take a very, very much long period of time to actually achieve this reality.
That's absolutely right. So theory and practice are very different. Let me bring Mayasa in at this precise moment. Mayasa, what do you make of all of this? Do you think that we're just having a hypothetical debate, or do you agree with one of those solutions? If you could briefly tell me what you think.
I think that, no, this is a very real issue, and it is going to advance. We are going to come face to face with it one day. I really agree. I agree with all of the speakers to an extent, but I mostly agree with Jamie. He made a really good point about finding a middle ground, how we need to find balance, how we need to regulate it, we need to control this, but it is going to happen.
So who's going to control it? Let me just ask you that really quickly. Who do we have in the world right now that can control this? We keep talking about control, but we don't know who's going to do it.
I think it's going to be the responsibility of the government to have a seat for everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm just going to briefly get to Hayam as well. Hayam, you've been nodding away and agreeing with some of the things that you saw. What is your take? And as well, let's take into consideration what my special guest had to say, Nawal had to say. What do you think about that?
Well, I want to say that the future generation already does not have a say on how they might turn out to be. So if I have a child or anyone else that has a child, I think they would prefer to not have those disorders or diseases, not be it for they want to get the required medical attention or the care, but because it's hard to live like that, it's hard to live in pain.
But let me ask you another question. Let's continue that theory along. Let's say that we don't just get rid of diseases and disorders. Let's say we can make superhumans, tall, white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired individuals. You and I can have those kind of babies. Why shouldn't we be allowed to?
I mean, people are already altering the way they look like from surgeries and Botox and everything. If they have another solution for it, why not go for it? But I just don't agree with the point that you can make your child look the way that you want to look, because that's you not accepting them the way they might turn out to be.
I appreciate that. Guys, I'm so appreciative of you standing by and making those comments. Lots of food for thought. All of them are science students, actually. So these are all very thoughtful kids who are commenting. Thank you, guys, for standing by, and thank you for your contributions. Okay, I'm just going to get to a couple of more of your comments, because this really has moved a lot of you. So the comment that I'm going to go with is Simon Chase in Pakistan again. Simon says, while the world is already divided on the basis of religion, caste, sect, and color, now it will be human versus modified human. We could be talking about the bifurcation of the human race. This is what Simon is raising. Now, it's time to go back to our final poll. The voting is now closed. Voting is now closed, and ooh, those numbers haven't moved too much. You guys have been voting, but we have very, very similar numbers. So 37% reject the idea of genetic enhancement or altering altogether. 36%, very closely behind, says that we must attempt it, but with certain guided values. 27% thinking that we should just go because it's a moral obligation. So that is a lot of food for thought. There's just one more comment that I want to read, because I don't quite know what the chair of the London Futurist Society is, but he has made a comment. His name is David Wood, and David says the inequality argument is a fair point, but a similar argument could be applied to rule out all new technologies, right? So where do you draw the line? Which tend to start off as very expensive. With good market oversight, the products can become much more affordable and accessible to all. Okay, I think there's just enough time for us to see the videos that you guys have been sending via Instagram. I am so thankful to you for sending them in. Let's see what you guys had to say.
I say yes. Gene editing probably will increase inequality because the richer people are, I think they'll take more advantage of the gene editing and be able to have access as versus poor people who don't have money. They won't be able to take and indulge in the gene editing as much as a rich person will. So I definitely think that would increase inequality amongst people.
Hey, No4, I'm opposed to gene editing because, once again, it is not like a computer program, and if you make a bug, it might be difficult to edit it, re-edit it, and fix the bug later because it's going to compound the issue further. Another reason why I'm opposed to gene editing is because it's going to create something called as a standardized human individual, and it's going to take away from something that's an important characteristic of our species, which is the uniqueness of the individual.
Watching from Switzerland, in response to Julian's arguments about well-being, is this something that we would have to agree upon universally, or is this just different according to different cultures?
I still think that just to maintain idealistic